Alrighty, thank you for watching another video. So this would normally be our monthly recap, but instead we're going to do year in review. But before I get to that, I need to get to this, which is Happy New Year. That was going to be a fun mess to clean up later. Alrighty, so year in review. I know I've said it before. There's literally just confetti all over my office now. So I've said it before, but every single time it's right. This has been an insanely busy year. An insanely busy year. So we're going to be talking about what's all happened this year. And the reason why is because a lot of the themes from this year are going to carry forward to the next year. And they're going to be relevant in 2024 just as they were relevant in 2023. So let's get into it. So year in review. We narrowly avoided 2 government shutdowns. That's really going to be relevant in the future here. The Fed hiked rates 4 times, 1% in total, so just a 0.25% each. We're going to be talking about where the Fed goes from here. There was multiple bank failures. At the time, it seemed like it was going to be, more widespread than it ultimately was. Thank all that is holy. But there were still some kind of themes to pull out of it, some interesting things to note that I'm going to time out. Inflation went on a wild ride. We're going to look at that real fast as well. And then finally, kind of mortgage rates as a whole. So just a quick summary on where mortgage rates went. They started the year at 6.5%. They quickly dropped all the way down to 6.125%. That was the low point for the year. They went all the way up to almost 8%, 7.875%. That was back in the middle of October. And then just recently, they've dropped down to where they started the year at around 6.5%. So it's been a wild ride for interest rates. We saw a very quick drop at the very beginning of the year, a very quick drop at the end of the year. But amongst the highest level we've seen in over 20 years in the middle of the year. So it's been a wild ride for interest rates as well. So starting with the drama that unfolded in the Congress. So in January, Kevin McCarthy was voted in as Speaker after 15 rounds. 15 rounds of voting. That was the first time in 100 years it's gotten to multiple ballots. It was also the longest Speaker contest in 164 years. And I went back and I looked at what was happening in 1859. That's when Oregon became the 33rd state. That's also when the Pikes Peak Gold Rush took place in Colorado. So and when we talk about like unprecedented times, it's been a long time since we've seen a lot of what's been going on in politics and the markets as a whole. Very, very unusual times. So as part of this, multiple rounds of balloting and trying to get voted as Speaker, Kevin McCarthy gave up a lot of his control. And one of the biggest pieces of control he gave up was he said that any single member of the House of Representatives could bring his speakership to a vote. Could basically say, hey, look, we don't want you as a speaker. We're going to bring this to a vote and see kind of what's going to happen. So he lost a lot of his leverage and lost a lot of his control. So he was speaker in January. That lasted all the way until October. And in October, Kevin McCarthy, passed a bipartisan funding bill deciding that, having the government shut down was going to be really, really bad for the economy and everybody else as a whole. So he passed a bipartisan funding bill. It funded the government through November 17th. The Freedom Caucus, they used that new power of having any single member be able to bring their speakership to a vote, and they removed McCarthy from the role. It then took 3.5 weeks, so almost a full month, to have a new speaker confirmed. It went to multiple ballots from multiple different people, and finally we ended up with Mike Johnson, which, ironically, it took 3.5 weeks to vote him as the new speaker, and it took so long that by the time he was voted speaker, he no longer had time to avoid another government shutdown without passing another bipartisan funding bill. And 93 of his fellow Republicans opposed the bill, but enough of them supported it because, as they summarized pretty well, once you touch the stove, you don't want to do it again, which is, look, we are kicking the can. We know we're kicking the can. We're buying ourselves some more time so we can dig in our heels a little bit more next time. We can come a little bit better prepared, have more time to kind of negotiate and finagle. Because of that, portions of the government are funded through January 19th. Others are only funded through February 2nd. So politics is going to be front and center in 2024. Not only do we have, obviously, the presidential election, but we also have, again, more potential for government shutdowns if we can't come to a resolution. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens. Definitely going to be a theme in 2024. Politics is really just going to dominate, I think. So as far as the Fed hiked rates 4 times in 2023. And 2022, though, is when most of the damage was done. They had hiked rates 7 hikes for 4.25%. 2023, it was only 1% and then 4 times. Now, after the last hike on June 26th, it was widely expected that there was going to be more work to be done. It was widely expected that the Fed was not done. There was going to be more hikes on the horizon, and the markets had basically baked that in. However, inflation started to come down, as everybody knew it would. And the whole reason the Fed's been hiking rates is to cause inflation to cool. Well, it takes time. There's a lag effect. From when the Fed hikes rates or cuts rates, it's going to take some time for it to actually work its way through the markets as a whole. In fact, the expectation is that it takes up to 12 months to actually see the full effect of some of those rate hikes. So they hiked rates in June, but then the effects from last year started to kick in, and inflation started to cool in a way that they were happy with and they were comfortable with. The Fed has signaled that they are done now with hikes. Woohoo! That's great news. The next step is going to be, it's funny, there's still confetti falling down. The next step is going to be when are there going to be rate cuts, not rate hikes, but rate cuts. And I'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So speaking of which, so this is what we call the Fed dot plot. Okay, so each one of these little dots indicates where the Fed members think rates should be, what they deem the appropriate monetary policy. So where do they think rates should be? So this is 2023. As you can see, they're all comfortable saying, okay, no more rate hikes, rates in the territory of between 5.25% and 5.5%. Of course, they're all in agreement because the Fed's done with their meetings this year. They should all be in agreement. If they're not, would have done that. After that, we looked at 2024. 15 of the 19 Fed members are expecting a cut between 0.5% and 1% cuts in 2024. Now, all this is kind of predicated on the unemployment rate not ticking up too much. If the unemployment rate were to start to increase quickly, you could expect to see more Fed cuts as well as more people supporting those cuts. It's also worth noting that the Fed's track record when it comes to predictions is downright awful. They have a terrible track record of trying to predict what rates are going to do. Downright awful. I'm sure none of these folks are right. That's the only thing I know for sure. But most of them are expecting, again, between 0.5% and 1% in cuts next year. As to when, again, kind of up to debate, but I'll get into a little bit of a couple prognosticators, what they're expecting. So we also had bank failures. This started off the year, and everybody thought it was going to be a much bigger kind of theme throughout the year. There was 6 banks that ultimately failed. Silicon Valley Bank, that's the one that everybody remembers. That was the one that started grabbing those headlines. It was also one of the largest institutions in the U.S. So what happened? Well, a lot of these banks, they had acquired what I'm going to be calling bad bets, which was they were buying up government debt last year or the year before when rates were exceedingly low. The pandemic hit. The Fed cuts rates down to a rate of 0 to 0.25%. Because of that, all of a sudden, those long-term bonds start paying less money. So the Treasury rates go down, government debt goes down, and yield. All of a sudden, those as the rates go down, the dividend you're going to be receiving from those is going to be much less. So a lot of institutions were acquiring a lot of that. Number one, they were flush with cash. They needed somewhere to put it. 2, they wanted to kind of hedge their bets in these very uncertain times. So they were buying a lot of pretty reliable debt, but they were doing so at historically low rates. Then rates started coming up. So if you bought a 10-year treasury at, let's say, 1%, and now today 10-year treasury is paying 5%, you would think that 1% treasury would still be worth 1%. That would be true unless you have to sell it. And then if you have to sell it, now all of a sudden you're competing with the other 5% debt. Why would I get paid 1% when I could just go across the street, buy that exact same investment structure and get paid 5%, 5 times as much? Well, all of a sudden that 1% is no longer going to be worth 1% if you have to sell it. So what happened with these banks is they had acquired a lot of really low interest rate paying debt, the bad bets. Rates started to increase. It started to devalue those bad bets. And then this is the important part. People started to withdraw their money from these institutions. All it takes is a little bit of fear, and people will start to withdraw money from those institutions. And as they start to withdraw money from those institutions no longer have enough money on hand, because banks, credit unions, they don't keep all that cash on hand. They invest it. That's how they can pay people interest, right? So they only keep a percentage of it on hand. They started to have to sell these bad bets at a loss to pay out, hey, these cash withdrawals that people are trying to take from our institution. And when that happens, now all of a sudden you're compounding the issue. You're selling at bad best, getting paid less money than you had originally paid for it, and you're doing so at a loss. And it just kind of compounds and causes a little bit of a snowball effect. So that's exactly what was happening. Now, a couple of things kind of rectify the situation. Number one, as institutions started to go illiquid and had to run on them, as they started to lose money and literally fail, banks started getting a little bit more conservative. Hey, we need to keep more capital on hand. Okay, so they started to hold more of their money on hand. They started to kind of plan for, what if somebody was to try to withdraw money from us in a big way? So that was number one. Number two, as I mentioned, the Fed stopped hiking rates in June. That gave financial institutions a little bit of leg up because they weren't sure what was going to happen after that June meeting. When the Fed stopped hiking rates, all of a sudden their books looked a little bit better. So if the Fed had kept hiking rates, it's entirely possible we could have seen additional failures. But given when they stopped and given the fact that institutions reacted pretty quickly to these other institutions failing, they were able to kind of plan accordingly and get ahead of it for their own sake. All right, so consequences of inflation and Fed hikes. So again, I've shown this before in some of my monthly recaps. I've updated it with the most recent data. So pandemic hit and everybody started just saving money in record amounts. First of all, we had nowhere to go, nowhere to spend it on, right? So groceries and walks around the park, that's all we could really do. So people started saving money at a record pace. And because of that, they started spending money at a record low. So the rate of spending revolving debt just plummeted. In addition to that, rates were really low. So even if you did have revolving debt, it wasn't costing you too much. And then the Fed starts to hike rates. And when they started to hike rates, that revolving debt just started skyrocketing. Again, causing kind of a little bit of a compounding effect. You have debt, but now your rates are higher and rates are higher and rates are higher, and it's causing more debt to get racked up. In addition, I think households as a whole develop some rather, I'm not going to say poor, but loose spending habits during the pandemic. We all kind of had the realization of you only live once, time to go out and, travel a little bit and see the world, because you never know when a pandemic's going to just come, cause everything to just button up. So people started going out and they started spending money. You only live once, let's go spend some money. And they were doing so as the Fed was hiking rates rather drastically and their credit card debts were skyrocketing. So the personal savings rate since the beginning of the pandemic has plummeted as people have spent more on credit card debt and revolving debt. So that's one big thing that we've noticed, and that was directly because of the Fed rate hikes that occurred and the pandemic as a whole. So this kind of leads to the big question, because this is probably not sustainable. The question then is this. So will the Fed have a soft landing? You've heard a lot about a soft landing in the news. Soft landing, soft landing, soft landing. The Fed thinks we're going to have a soft landing. A soft landing would be you have all these Fed rate hikes, you start to cut rates, and you do so in a way that there's no recession. That's the Fed's definition of a soft landing. Can we avoid a recession? Yes or no? Well, as the rates have increased, that revolving debt has skyrocketed. So consumers are likely to start spending less money as that debt kind of catches up, and they're sick of stretching their households. Savings rate is at an all-time low. The consumer debt is at an all-time high. Eventually, you have to start kind of balancing your books and spending less, saving more money. As folks spend less money, as consumers spend less money, employers are then going to hire less people. They just have less money, right? The less money that's being spent, the less money companies are bringing in. And because of that, they're going to be either hiring less or possibly even cutting jobs. The Fed is predicting the unemployment rate to rise very, very slightly from 3.7% to 4.1%. That's a very minor increase. I'd say it's somewhat of an optimistic increase, but we shall see. If they do that, chances of a soft landing are going to be very high. They're going to be able to avoid a recession. Only a 4% unemployment rate would be amazing. So it's going to lead to a contraction in the economy. It's a question really of how much is it going to contract. Experts are varying on this. So I'd say the experts are pretty much split. Half think we're going to have a soft landing, albeit somewhat bumpy landing. Others are predicting a mild recession. There's very, very few people that are predicting a really significant or severe recession. Most are predicting a mild recession. I'd say the odds all in all are about 50%. Most folks are predicting that if we do have a mild recession, it's probably going to be in the beginning of 2024. First half, somewhere in there. And that a recession is defined as, two consecutive quarters of negative GDP. Now, that's not always the case. We've seen it before where we've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP, and it was not officially considered a recession. So there's an extra step where the financial gurus have to basically sign off on it and say, yes, this is officially a recession. So if the unemployment rate does start to increase more, like I said, the Fed's going to probably get more aggressive with cuts. This says hikes. Sorry, I should say cuts. All right, so inflation is well on its way to the Fed target. So there's 3 different inflation metrics that I've talked about before: PPI, Producer Price Index, the core rate, which removes volatile food and energy components from the calculus, and it's probably the most important one because, as you know, energy prices can skyrocket. Same thing with food. There's bird flu that breaks out, and all of a sudden the price of chicken skyrockets temporarily, like eggs, stuff like that, bread, milk. So core rate is with all that food and energy removed from the calculus, makes it a little bit more stable and a little bit more usable, really. So PPI, Producer Price Index, that's the price that companies pay for goods on a wholesale level. Eventually, that leads to savings to the consumer. As companies pay less for goods, they eventually pass that savings along. So that core rate is at 2%. It was once as high as 11.7%. Like, that's crazy. Consumer Price Index, that's inflation as you and I feel it. That core rate is at 4%. That was once as high as 9.1%. So again, significant improvement on the inflation front. Now, personal consumption expenditures, PCE, that is the Fed's favorite measure of inflation. So that core rate is now at 3.2%. We just got that data last week. That is now at 3.2%. The Fed wants that rate to get down to 2%. So we're making really good progress on getting towards that Fed target. Annualized, if you took our 6-month reading, you just spread that out over 12 months, the annualized 6-month reading is at 1.85%. If we see what we've seen in the last 6 months and we just have another 6 months of that, we will hit the Fed's target. And if we hit the Fed's target, the Fed can start to get a little bit more aggressive with those Fed cuts. So cuts are definitely on the horizon. When is kind of the big question. The expectation is that March or June is probably going to be when we first see that first rate cut. So March or June, circle those Fed dates on your calendar. Those are the most likely candidates for the first rate cut. Fed's probably going to stop hiking rates, leave it alone for a bit, and then starting in March, I think the temperature is going to start to heat up on them and see what they do. Mortgage rates will continue to decrease as inflation continues to decrease. Now, the Fed funds rate and mortgage rates are not directly tied to another, but they're reacting to the same things, which is inflation. So as inflation comes down, mortgage rates will come down as well. Again, it's a long-term bond. Bonds hate inflation because it eats in that fixed rate of return that they offer. So as inflation comes down, mortgage rates will come down as well. That'd be great news for me and for you. Politics, like I said, is going to dominate the calendar. Portions of the government are funded only through January 19th, others through February 2nd. Presidential election, big one. Tuesday, November 5th. It's going to be a big one, as we all know. So, plan on that. Q4 business earnings are going to be very, very telling. If we are going to have a recession, if we are going to start to have a significant contraction of the economy, it's probably going to start in Q4, like right now. Like how much were consumers spending for the holidays? All of that is going to be quite relevant. We shall see. We're also going to see the jobs numbers as well. That's going to be on the docket for next week. Going to be very, very important. So we shall see what that looks like. And then the biggest question is, will the Fed accomplish their goal of soft landing? Honestly, most of the experts have been pretty down on this and saying, hey, look, there's just no way that the Fed's going to have it. I'd say, less experts are saying that. I mean, it's really gone kind of starting to turn around a little bit. Some of the bigger banks are predicting we'll have a mild recession. Others are saying, the Fed might actually do it. It's probably not going to be very smooth soft landing, but it's entirely possible that we could theoretically thread that needle and not have a recession when all of this is said and done. So going to be a wild year ahead as well. And again, it was kind of a wild year that we just went through. So thank you all so much again. I really, really appreciate you. Happy New Year again. And see you in the new year. And if you have any questions, as always, let us know. And lastly, can't say it enough. Thank you all so much for the referrals. It really is the lifeblood of our business. I tell my team all the time, like, one thing we all have in common is that our love language is acts of service. So being able to help you, being able to help your referrals, it truly just brings us happiness. I love nothing more than answering questions and helping folks out. So thank you all so very much. Appreciate you all. Have a wonderful new year. And see you in 2024. Thanks. Bye.